All right, well, welcome back. So, where we left off before we took our early break was talking about the cerebral hemispheres. And so, the top of the slide says cerebral cortex. So, remember that the arrangement of the brain is such that the most superior portion of the cerebral hemispheres is a cerebral cortex, which is the book refers to it as a bark of gray matter. And then deep to that is white matter. And so remember that gray matter is cell bodies. And so the cerebral cortex then is just a cluster of cell bodies on the superficial surface of the brain that generate electrical signals, generate action potentials to communicate with other parts of the body, or they receive information from other parts of the body. And then deep to that gray matter, you've got white matter. And remember that white matter is tracts, so TRACTS, tracts. And those are bundles of axons that relay information from one group of neurons with similar function to other areas. So those other areas may be the thalamus, they may be the cerebellum, they may go down the spinal cord to alpha motor neurons. So one of the things that we touched on a little bit before we left was this concept of lateralization. So remember that the cerebrum, so you've got two cerebral hemispheres, there's a left and a right. And so the two of them look very similar. They both have similar looking gyri and sulci and fissures and all of that, but they are functionally somewhat different. So in most people, they are left side dominant. And so what that means is that the area of the brain in charge of language is on the left side of the brain. So for example, Broca's area is responsible for the production of speech, like the physical production of it in terms of contracting the muscles involved in making the sound. And then you've got Wernicke's area, also on the left side, that is responsible for the understanding of speech. So where the production and understanding of speech are on the left side of the brain, then that's considered then left hemisphere dominance. And so again, in about 90% of the population, most of us have those parts of the brain on the left side. So most of us then are left hemisphere dominant, which then produces right-handedness. Now that said, if somebody is left-handed, then what can be the case is that those language centers and all of that are then on the right side. So basically the hemispheres get flipped. So just because you're left-handed, though, is not to say that you are necessarily right hemisphere dominant, because still about 60% of people who are left-handed still have the language centers on the left side of the brain, but the odds are more likely that your cerebral hemispheres are flipped and that you are right hemisphere dominant. So again, the two hemispheres are somewhat distinct in what they do. So the left side of the brain tends to be very logical. It places things in order. So for example, if you look down at your feet, the left hemisphere knows that you have to put on your socks before you put on your shoes. It orders tasks. It puts letters in order to help you make sense of a word, and then it puts the words in a sentence in order and then makes meaning out of that sentence. So the left hemisphere is the one that is the very logical, orderly part of the brain. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, as you can see there, is the more artistic side of the brain. We associate it with emotion. But those two function very complementary to each other. So if you're having a conversation with somebody, and we're going to assume left hemisphere dominant, playing the odds. If you're having a conversation with somebody, the left hemisphere is the side of the brain that understands what is being said and interprets that information. But the right hemisphere is focused on all of the sort of nonverbal cues. So the right hemisphere focuses on things like body language, but it also includes things like their tone. And so one of the things in terms of the way that they work together is that if somebody is telling you something, like you're talking to a roommate and they tell you that they were out at the library really late last night, and they're telling you that, you understand those words on the left side of your brain, but as they're telling you that, if they are kind of shifting their position and their eyes are going side to side and they look really uncomfortable, the right side of your brain picks up on those nonverbal cues and says, wait a minute, those nonverbal cues are inconsistent with what they're telling me, so then I would interpret that as them lying. And so that's one of the ways that the two hemispheres work together. Another way is that the left hemisphere tells us effectively where our body begins and ends, and the right hemisphere helps localize us to where we are in a larger space. So it puts me where I am in a room and tells me that I am 10 feet from the door or 5 feet from the table, or whatever the case may be. So the left is the very literal side of the brain. The right side of the brain understands larger context. So another example that I've seen to discuss the difference between the two is if you were playing blackjack, so you're playing cards at a casino, and somebody says hit me, the left side of your brain interprets that to mean that they might physically want to be struck, right? But the right side of the brain understands the bigger context, and so they're referring to a move or a step that they can take within the game. So the right side understands that larger context. And if somebody had damage to the right side of their brain, well, then they might not understand that larger context, and they might take that expression literally, because then the left side of the brain is the one that's dominant. All right, so from there, moving on to the diencephalon, maybe. Maybe not. There we go, now we got it to work. Okay, so from there, moving on to the diencephalon. So you can see there that the diencephalon consists of three structures. So you've got the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So where it says gray matter, again referring to what we talked about on the last slide and previously. So remember that if you've got gray matter, that you have cell bodies. So the thalamus is composed of, or comprised of, 7 different types of nuclei. And so remember that in terms of terminology, a nucleus in the central nervous system, or nuclei plural, is a group or a cluster of cell bodies. And then if we're talking about outside of the central nervous system, then a ganglia is a group, or ganglion. Those are a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So the thing I want you to know about the thalamus, I don't really need you to know a whole lot, but be aware that it is the major relay station for information coming into the cerebral cortex. So remember last time that we talked about the primary somatosensory cortex and then the somatosensory association area. The primary somatosensory cortex, remember that what we do there is we localize things like touch, pressure, movement, etc. So we're aware of where the body is in space, we're aware of things touching us and all of that kind of thing. That information travels up the spinal cord and synapses in the thalamus first, and then is relayed from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex, where we localize that. So effectively, when the impulses reach the thalamus, we have a crude recognition of whether a sensation is pleasant or unpleasant, but we don't really localize it until that information is transmitted even farther or higher up into the primary somatosensory cortex. The thalamus also serves as a relay station for information coming from the cerebellum, which we'll talk about in a minute. The short version of what the cerebellum does is helps us refine our movements. So the cerebellum is also involved in posture and involuntary muscle contraction, but one of the things that it helps us to do is to refine our movements a little bit, to coordinate how we move. And so some of the axons from the cerebellum also then synapse in the thalamus, and then from there synapse or interact with the primary motor cortex, which is what initiates that voluntary muscle contraction. So the thalamus then acts as this relay center, relaying information from the body to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then also relaying information about movement from the cerebellum up to the primary motor cortex, so that we can modulate muscle contraction or the number of muscles involved, that kind of thing. The hypothalamus, on the other hand, so I should have probably pointed out where the thalamus is. So if you look at the drawing down here, the thalamus is this kind of egg-shaped purple thing, and so then just below that is the hypothalamus. So in the case of the hypothalamus, hypo is below, and so the hypothalamus is, as you would imagine, physically below the thalamus. And so you can see there that it controls the autonomic nervous system. Remember that the autonomic nervous system is involuntary muscle contractions, all of your involuntary motor responses to your environment. So that includes things like when your heart rate speeds up, when your blood pressure goes up, for example, when you're scared or nervous. that is the autonomic nervous system controlling that. So where it says physical response to emotions, the hypothalamus has neurons that synapse with the brainstem that then act to speed up heart rate, for example, if you're scared. So in addition to that, the hypothalamus regulates a bunch of different things. You can see there that it regulates body temperature. So the hypothalamus has nuclei that are sensitive to things like, obviously, the temperature of the blood. And so in response to a temperature that's too high, they will work to initiate sweating, or it's responsible for initiating the cooling response of sweating. And then if our core temperature gets too low, then the hypothalamus is responsible for initiating shivering. So other things that it does includes that it is responsible for regulating hunger, as you can. So, for example, one of the things that the hypothalamus does is it monitors blood sugar. And so if blood sugar gets too low, then what it'll do is to stimulate hunger. Or it's also responsive to a number of other hormones. So the hormone, the second one down, ghrelin is sometimes referred to as the hunger hormone. And so ghrelin is secreted by the stomach when it's empty, and then that has the effect on the hypothalamus of stimulating hunger. On the other hand, cholecystokinin, or CCK, is a hormone that we've talked about previously. That one is released from the small intestine in response to high-fat chyme. Chyme is the stuff that leaves the stomach and moves into the small intestine. So in response to high-fat chyme, we'll get the release of cholecystokinin, and so then that produces a feeling of fullness. Another thing in the hypothalamus is that it monitors the osmotic pressure in the blood, so it basically monitors how concentrated your blood is. So obviously if you get dehydrated, then your blood is going to become more concentrated, so then it's going to stimulate thirst. So in addition to that, it's also going to cause the release of antidiuretic hormone. That's what ADH stands for. And so antidiuretic hormone causes you to reabsorb more fluid in the kidneys, so you don't secrete as much fluid, you don't produce as much urine to try to hang on to the fluid that you have. And as mentioned, it also stimulates thirst. And then the hypothalamus also plays a role in our sleep and wake cycles. So it keeps us on our 24-hour clock. And it works with the epithalamus. So the epithalamus, one of the things that it does is secretes melatonin, which occurs to some extent in response to light and darkness. So whenever it gets dark, we secrete more melatonin, and then that produces a feeling of being tired. So that's all I want you to know. So things to know. So the thalamus, know that it's the relay center. The hypothalamus, know that it controls the autonomic nervous system. And then the epithalamus is responsible for sleep and wake, are kind of the big things I want you to know there. All right. So then we'll move on to the brainstem. There we go. So the brainstem, so just like with the diencephalon, there's three parts to it. So you've got the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Those three are in order superior to inferior. And they basically, the brainstem, what it does is forms a bridge between the diencephalon, the area that we just talked about, and the spinal cord. So for example, starting most inferiorly, the medulla oblongata is essentially, it's continuous with the spinal cord. And where the medulla starts is right at the foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is a big hole in the base of the skull. So it starts there and extends all the way up into the pons, which I say all the way, it's less than 2 inches. So it's not very long. But having said that, I'm going to jump back up to the midbrain. So things to know about the midbrain. The first, and I think most interesting from a sporting standpoint, is there's a nucleus in the midbrain, a group of cells in the midbrain called the para-aqueductal gray. And so what the para-aqueductal gray does is it helps block pain signals coming up the spinal cord. So it's responsible for what's referred to as descending pain control. And so where you see descending pain control is if you've ever been injured in a big game, like let's say you rolled your ankle during a big basketball game, but it was the district championship or conference championship or something like that. And so you just kept playing, didn't really feel it, and then later when you cooled off, you notice how badly you'd injured yourself, and then it suddenly starts to hurt quite a bit. Part of that's the fact that it takes the inflammatory process a little while to get going, but part of it is that ability to engage in descending pain control, to basically keep pain signals from reaching the brain. And so effectively what we can do is that the paraqueductal gray synapses with some other neurons in the medulla oblongata, so lower down, synapses with some of those, and then they synapse down at that spinal cord, at different spinal cord levels, and they basically block the signal. They inhibit, if you will, that second order afferent. They keep the signal from coming up the spinal cord. And so once we keep those pain signals from coming up the spinal cord, then we don't perceive quite as much pain. So that's kind of the interesting thing about the midbrain. The other thing is that there is something, there's an area of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is on either side of the thalamus. And so the basal ganglia, even though it's called the ganglia, is actually a nucleus because it's clusters of cell bodies. But the midbrain works with the basal ganglia to control subconscious muscle activity. So it's involved in postural stuff like keeping your head up and aligning your spine and all of that. So when we get the loss of those neurons, so for example, if you get the loss of neurons in the midbrain, then we associate that, or that is associated with Parkinson's type tremors. So it plays a role in suppressing muscle contraction when we don't want it. So it does play an important role there. The pons, there's not too much to know about it. It's going to relay motor information to the cerebellum, and again, we'll talk about the cerebellum in a second, but what its job, the cerebellum's job, is to refine movement. And so one of the other things that the pons does is also plays a role in the regulation of breathing. Again, most inferior there is our medulla oblongata. So there's three important things there in the medulla oblongata. There are more, but there's three primary things that are of note for us. So the first is decussation of the pyramids. And what that means, so remember that in your primary motor cortex, the cells that initiate voluntary muscle contraction are called pyramidal cells. And also remember that the right side of your brain is responsible for controlling the left side of the body. Left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So what happens there is that those axons from those pyramidal cells switch sides, and where that occurs is in the medulla oblongata. They switch from the right side of the brain, or in this case the right side of the medulla, to the left side as they go down the spinal cord. And so decussation of the pyramids is where the axons of those pyramidal cells switch sides from right to left or left to right. So that's what that means. You've also, in the medulla, got the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. And what both of those do is the cardiac center, for example, adjusts the force and rate of heart contraction. So it speeds up heart rate or causes an increase in blood pressure. And then the respiratory center is responsible for the rhythm of breathing. So where we initiate those, sometimes the medulla oblongata is referred to as the reptile brain because it's what keeps your heart beating and what keeps you breathing. And so that's one of the important things that it does. All right, so let's click on to the next one. Talk about cerebellum quickly. There we go. So the cerebellum, as mentioned, its primary job is to fine-tune our coordination. So as you can see there, so the cerebellum, I don't have it recording my pointer for right now. Now I do. There you go. So you should be able to see my pointer. So the cerebellum is down here. So the areas where we were just talking about, so there's your thalamus, there's your hypothalamus, and then we were just talking about the brainstem, so that's all this green here. So the cerebellum is back here on this posterior and inferior part of the brain. It actually takes up a pretty significant, or makes up a significant portion of the brain's mass. And as you can see there from that sagittal cut, that it's got a similar arrangement to the cerebral hemispheres, at least insofar as it's got this bark of gray matter, and then it's got white matter deep to it, and then even deeper to that, there are a couple little clusters of gray matter. There are a couple little nuclei deep to that. It's also folded like the cerebrum is, and so then, as with the cerebrum, that's going to increase surface area. There are also right and left hemispheres, and then there are also lobes in this case. So the lobes that we talked about in the cerebral hemisphere, so we got your frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, occipital, and then the insula. in the case of the cerebellum, there's only an anterior and a posterior lobe. So again, the primary function for the cerebellum is to basically observe a movement. I don't know that observe is the right word there, but evaluate a movement is probably a better way to go with that. Evaluate a movement, and did what we expected to happen, did that happen? So, for example, if you were, let's say, wadding up some paper and throwing it at the trash can, and so you shoot your paper wad at the trash can and you dramatically undershoot. So that's not what we expected to happen, not what we intended to happen. And so the cerebellum then would evaluate that and realize that we need maybe more muscle contraction because we dramatically undershot. We need a stronger contraction of triceps. And so it, through neurons that synapse in the thalamus and then neurons that go from the thalamus to the primary motor cortex, we would then increase the contraction. We'd increase motor unit recruitment in the triceps so that we get a stronger elbow extension, and hopefully then we'd be able to make the next basket that we shot. So it evaluates how well movements initiated by the primary motor cortex are being carried out. So other things it does, there's really two other things, and those are to regulate posture and balance. So it's responsible for things like keeping your head up, but also keeping you from falling over. All right, so click on to the next one, maybe. There we go. All right, so then we've got our meninges, which are coverings of the brain. So there are 3 meninges on there, and they are discussed from superficial to deep. So the most superficial is the dura mater, the middle one obviously is the arachnoid mater, and then the deepest one is the pia mater. So you can see the functions of the meninges there. So it protects the central nervous system, and then encloses blood vessels, helps protect them, and then also contains the cerebrospinal fluid, which is what the brain floats in. So in the case of the dura mater, so it's got 2 layers. There's a periosteal layer. So remember the periosteum, when we talked about bone, is the outer covering of bone. So in the case of the dura mater, it is a layer of tissue that lines the inside of the skull. And then you've got the meningeal layer, which is sort of this tough protective outer covering of the brain. So underneath that is our arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater, it's called that because it kind of looks like a spider's web, and you can see that pretty big space underneath the arachnoid mater. So that's the subdural space, and that's where your cerebrospinal fluid is in that subdural space. And in addition to that, you can see there's a couple little blood vessels in there. Because of the really loose connective tissue that is the arachnoid mater, so you've just got these sort of strands of collagen here and there. Because of its looseness, it doesn't really protect those blood vessels very well, which will be significant here in a second. And then you've got the pia mater. So the pia mater is fairly thin. It's not really all that protective. It's, as this book says, it's a delicate connective tissue that clings tightly to the brain. So, and also the pia mater also follows the blood vessels, or is a layer of connective tissue around the blood vessels as they penetrate into the brain as well. So I've got a case study for you. All right, so we're going to pretend that you're a football coach. You're watching on the sideline, and one of your players takes a really vicious helmet-to-helmet hit and is knocked unconscious on the field. So you go running out onto the field, and again, you notice that he's unconscious, but he recovers consciousness pretty quickly. So he's unconscious for less than a minute, and since then he's been pretty lucid, meaning he's pretty with it. So when you talk to him, he doesn't really seem to be confused, maybe a little bit, but not much. And there's no amnesia that you're aware of. So really, despite the fact that he was knocked out, he's pretty with it. So obviously you can't let him go back in the game because he was knocked out. He very clearly has a concussion. So he hangs out on the sideline for the rest of the game. Again, still seems fairly normal. And then when you're talking to him after the game, a couple hours later, you notice that he's just kind of out of it. And so he's increasingly confused. He's increasingly tired. He's slow to respond when you ask him questions. And then just to complete the scenario, we'll say that he also vomits. So the question is, what could be happening? So he got knocked out. He was fine for an hour or more. And then all of a sudden, at least to you, about an hour later, again, or more, or a little bit more than that, he has all these symptoms. So what could be happening here? Well, what I'm describing to you is something called an epidural hematoma. And so in the case of an epidural hematoma, you have the bleeding inside. You have a bleeding inside of the skull is what it is. So an epidural hematoma is an arterial bleed. So it's a tear of an artery that sits between the skull and the dura mater. So in that case, when you have an arterial bleed, remember that your arteries are the high pressure side, and so that's where you're going to get lots of bleeding really quickly. So as that blood starts to accumulate in the brain, it'll obviously then press on the brain, which then impairs the brain's function. So that's why you start to get confusion, you start to get tiredness, maybe amnesia, and slow responses, those kinds of things. And it's because of that mechanical pressure on the brain as the blood starts to accumulate inside of the skull. So one of the things with epidural hematomas, they're pretty uncommon. So they're probably less than 5% of head injuries, and that's maybe a high estimate. It may be more like 1 to 2%. But with them, they account for probably somewhere around 10-20% of the deaths, depends on which of the studies you look at. One of the helpful things is that because they're an arterial bleed, the symptoms become obvious fairly quickly, and so because of that, they get emergency treatment fairly quickly as well. And so with that treatment, then they're able to drain that and reduce the pressure on the brain, and so then the symptoms go away. A subdural hematoma, on the other hand, can be an arterial bleed, but typically it's a venous bleed. And so what happens with a subdural hematoma is that you get a tear of a blood vessel, again, usually a vein, that's between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. And so when that happens, because it's a venous bleed, remember that the veins are the low pressure side, so whenever you give blood, for example, that blood comes out of a vein, and as you've noticed, if you've ever watched it, it just kind of like oozes out of the blood vessel and into the receiving vessel. So with that, if you tear a vein inside of the skull, the blood accumulates over a much longer period of time. And in fact, sometimes it can be days later before they start to become symptomatic. Now, that's uncommon, but it can be several days. Typically, it's over the course of 12-ish hours or less, but depends upon numerous factors, including their age. So your brain shrinks with age, and so with that, it stretches some of those blood vessels in that subdural space, and so they're both more likely to get them, and the symptoms can maybe take a little bit longer for them to become manifest. But nonetheless, the subdural hematoma, one of the things about them is that they are, because the symptoms take so long to set in, those account for about 30% of the deaths related to traumatic brain injuries. So if you've ever had a roommate or a sibling or somebody that you've been around that's had a concussion and you took them to the hospital, and the doctor said, well, wake them up every 2 hours or every hour, whatever they told you. The reason they're having you wake them up, you're basically checking for a subdural hematoma. If they've become unresponsive, then obviously you have to call 911. And so what the doctor is trying to get you to do is to make sure that they are continuing to be responsive, that they don't have an intracranial bleed. So that's why you're doing that. All right, cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is located between the arachnoid and the pia mater, so between those two deeper meninges. And so you can see the functions of it there. So the first there is buoyancy. It helps the brain float, and in doing that, it takes some of the weight off of the brain. So without being able to float, then the brain would, to some extent, kind of collapse under its own weight. So that's an important thing that it does. But as the brain floats, that fluid is pretty difficult to compress, and so that allows the brain some level of protection whenever the head starts or stops. So we talked about concussions previously, and so concussions result from the head accelerating or decelerating, and that puts shear stress on the neurons. And so one of the things that the cerebrospinal fluid does is sort of protects the brain and keeps it from bumping up against the skull, so it provides that protection from bumping up against the bony barrier. So there's some mechanical protection there as well, but it also provides chemical protection. So in the cerebrospinal fluid, you've got both positively charged ions, so you've got stuff like sodium, potassium, and calcium, and your negatively charged ions, things like chloride. And so with all of those ions, it helps provide this optimal chemical environment for the neurons to function. And then the other thing that it does is it helps nourish the neurons in the neuroglia. So it allows for the exchange of nutrients and waste products, and brings oxygen to those neurons into the neuroglia, and then helps them get rid of their metabolic waste products like carbon dioxide. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates, and we actually turn it over about once every 8 hours. So we've got it not only in constant motion, but we're also constantly filtering it and making new cerebrospinal fluid as well. It comes from the plasma, and so you can see there on that diagram here where it originates near number 1. So it comes out of a capillary bed. You basically pull fluid, we pull plasma from that capillary bed, and then it goes through the ependymal cells and becomes cerebrospinal fluid. And then our last thing for this chapter is our blood-brain barrier. Oop, there we go, came back. All right, so our blood-brain barrier. So the primary job of the blood-brain barrier is to, as you can see there, provide a stable chemical environment for the brain. Because one of the things that we can't have in the brain are, we can't have it being affected by big swings in hormones. So for example, like during exercise, you're going to see big increases in epinephrine, norepinephrine release, release of glucagon and numerous others, and then increases or decreases in amino acids or glucose in the blood, those kinds of things. And so those kinds of big swings could be problematic for the brain. So we want it to not be exposed to those big swings in hormones or fluxes in amino acids, those kinds of things. And so we keep the brain pretty well walled off. There are only a few things that we allow in. So things like oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse across the blood-brain barrier pretty easily. And then certain fat-soluble things like alcohol, nicotine, anesthetics, those can pass across the blood-brain barrier pretty easily. Glucose we have to actively transport, so it means it takes energy to pump it into the brain. But we're pretty specific about what we allow in there, and among those things is not fat, because fat, triglycerides are pretty big. So the brain runs on glucose, so that's an important thing to know. So in terms of the blood-brain barrier, what is it? Effectively what it is 3 things. So you've got in the blood vessels of the brain, you have a continuous endothelium, and remember that the endothelium is the inside of a blood vessel, and so those cells are all stuck together really, really closely, and they have tight junctions to keep things from passing between them. So you've got really close relationship between those cells lining the inside of that blood vessel wall so that things can't pass between them. And then outside of the blood vessel, you have this really thick layer of connective tissue, the basal lamina, and so that if something gets past those tight junctions or gets through those endothelial cells, the basal lamina makes it harder for it to diffuse into the brain. And then the last thing there, what I've got my picture of, is the astrocyte. And the astrocyte, as mentioned previously, is that it has these feet that wrap around the capillaries. And so one of the things that they do is they regulate blood flow to the brain, by opening or closing those capillaries. But in addition to that, those feet serve to thicken the effectively they reinforce that basal lamina, so there's a greater distance that substances have to diffuse to get from the bloodstream into the brain. So between those 3 things, between the continuous endothelium, the thick basal lamina, and then the feet of the astrocytes, it's really, really difficult for most substances to get out of the blood and into the brain. And so the blood-brain barrier then helps protect the brain from things like viruses, bacteria, those kinds of things. All right, so that's all I have for the end of chapter 12. I'll work to get chapter 13 up in the next couple days. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more entertaining. So we'll see you in a few days.